We really appreciate you all coming here today for the Pew Center on the State's Conference on Upgrading Voter Registration in California. I'm David Becker. I'm the Project Director for Election Initiatives with the Pew Center on the States. I am a Californian. I went to Berkeley for both undergrad and law school. Go Bears. And it's good to be home. All right, all you Stanford people, settle down. We'll go into a great deal of detail about this later on during the day, but just to give you some background, after the 2008 election, Pew held a major convening in Washington, D.C. With election officials from both the state and local level, academics, media, campaign operatives, etc. And we were looking back at the 2008 elections and elections in general, and we asked the question of virtually everybody there, what was the single biggest problem in election administration? And you recall there was a lot of news about early voting at that time and vote by mail and other things. We expected a variety of answers, but it was nearly unanimous that the single biggest problem in election administration is voter registration. And that came from both parties. It came from across a set of disciplines. The counsel for the Obama campaign and the counsel for the McCain campaign both agreed 100% the single biggest problem was voter registration. So we started studying this issue, and we've been studying it now for over 2 years, seeking to identify the problems, get a good handle on them, and also hopefully make some recommendations that can fix it, not just in kind of a piecemeal or Band-Aid approach, but look at really comprehensive solutions that can bring us from a voter registration system that was designed primarily for the 19th century and bring it into the 21st century. Well, we've got a really great and diverse set of experts here to speak on these issues today. We're really happy to have such a knowledgeable group. I should mention very briefly, I'm very pleased to see Secretary Bowen's staff in here too. We've talked with them and worked with them for quite some time, and they've been great. And we did invite Secretary Bowen to be here today, but we understand she's not in Sacramento, so that's unfortunate, but we're very, very glad to see members of her staff here today. I also want to quickly thank Chairman Fong and his staff for helping us with the room and supporting this conference to such a great degree. I want to go through some quick housekeeping, and then we'll get started. Most of you have probably seen the agenda. We'll be starting with this, then Gail's going to give a few remarks. I'm going to give some remarks. We'll go through some public opinion research that we have, and then we'll start with panel discussions. There'll be a lunch break from around 12:30 to 1:30, and we'll start promptly at 1:30. Our goal is hopefully to end before 4 o'clock when we originally scheduled to end, so that everyone can get back home, especially given that the legislature is leaving today. Materials are out on a table outside that door. We have some reports that we've produced and other materials, and please feel free to take those and review them. We've also, on our website, if they're not already posted, they will be posted very shortly. And the website where you can find materials related to this conference, both today and later, is right up here, pewcenteronthestates.org/elections/California. I should also tell you we're videotaping today's events, and we understand the California channel might rebroadcast this in a couple weeks. We'll post details on that on the website once we know about that, and we may also be posting highlights at some future date. Once we get to the panel discussions, there will be opportunity for questions, and we'd really like to engage all of you in the discussion. So there is a microphone over there I just want to point out near Sam Dierheimer, Pew staff over there. So just so you know, that'd be the good place to go for the questions. And lastly, I just want to introduce all the Pew staff that's here today who've done a great job in setting this all up, and they're available to you if you have any questions throughout the day. We have Geeta Ram, who's sitting in the third row right here. She just raised her hand. We've got Sam Dierheimer, who I already pointed out. Where is Courtney in here?
She's outside.
Courtney Dozier is outside, so when you don't recognize someone, that's Courtney. And is John Limback in here? John Limback in the back. So you can feel free to approach any of them. They won't bite. They're all very nice people. So that's about it. With that, let's get started. I want to start by introducing Gail Pellerin. Gail's been a great asset and resource and partner on this, and she's president of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. So we wanted to hear from her at the beginning. She served as a Santa Cruz County Clerk and Registrar of Voters since July of 2004 and was elected to her second four-year term in June of 2010. She was elected president of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials in July of 2010, and she began her tenure in Santa Cruz County as the elections manager back in 1993 after having spent 7 years working for the legislature here in Sacramento. Prior to that time, Gail worked as a newspaper reporter. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gail for a few remarks on this.
Thank you, David. I might be a little hoarse. I took my 13-year-old daughter to the American Idol concert yesterday in San Jose. For the record, James Durbin rocks. And he's also someone who really understands the importance of voting. If you all remember, he was voted off American Idol when we all thought he was going to be the American Idol. But it was a fun concert, nevertheless. Thank you to my colleagues for being here today and the participants who are here, and David Becker. It's so much more fun to work with you now that you're with Pew versus that former job you had with the U.S. Department of Justice. It wasn't as much fun then. As president of CACEO, we are an association with 570 members statewide, representing 58 counties in the state in the areas of elections, county clerk and clerk of the board, and our members include many city clerks as well as Secretary of State staff. The Pew Center on the States has been a great partner with CACEO and the state of California and shares CACEO's goals for an election system that is accurate, convenient, efficient, transparent, and secure. Among elections officials, our primary goal is to ensure all interested and eligible citizens can register and vote. Our association has endorsed legislation such as SB 397 by Senator Paul Fong to permit online voter registration. We've actually come a very long way in California since the beginning of registration. I have registration rolls that date back to a time when we had to know whether you had a scar on your face or a mole or missing a limb in order to get you registered. There was also a time when people registered, they included their occupation. And our voter registration form has taken on a lot of different forms, and now we collect email addresses, and we become much more efficient in how we're doing things. But still, it's time to bring voter registration to the 21st century and upgrade it. We are honored here today to have a knowledgeable and distinguished group of speakers representing policy groups and election officials from several states, including our great state of California. I encourage everyone here to keep an open mind as we discuss the role of voter registration, evaluating its effectiveness, ideas on how to improve the system, and options for technology to improve how elections officials in California maintain and update our voter rolls. I encourage everyone here to keep an open mind as new ideas are discussed. I'm reminded of a time when pundits thought that the computer had achieved as much as we were going to see it achieve, and there was absolutely no way anyone would ever want one in their home. Now most homes have personal computers, and I have just joined the ranks of all of you iPhone people, where I now carry my computer in my pocket, and I love it, although I haven't quite figured all the bells and whistles out, but my 13-year-old daughter knows the insides and outsides of this. And that next generation is going to be a generation who is very comfortable with technology and how it improves their lives. But I don't think we've done everything we can do, and there's a lot more that's going to be in our futures. I applaud the efforts of Pew and my colleagues on developing ways to improve our voter registration system. The system we now have is prone to errors. It fails to keep up with our mobile society. It's inefficient, costly, labor, and very paper intensive. When we had an earthquake in Santa Cruz, all those voter registration cards fell down, and they were in a nice numerical order, and it took a long time to get those back on the shelves in an order. And in a society that relies more on the internet, technology, and social media, where we can pay our bills online, we can track a package at every point of handling, download movies and iTunes or tunes in seconds, we need to come up with a better way to register voters in our state. I believe the only thing permanent in life, and in elections for that matter, is change. So I hope you join me in exploring the changes that we're going to be discussing today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gail. And I know there are many county election officials here in the room. If it isn't too much to ask, would you all mind standing up just for a second so we can notice you and also applaud you for all the work you do on a daily basis to make elections work in California? Thanks. So let's get right into the meat of the discussion, what we're all here about. I want to share with you our work, our research, and our recommendations so I can provide a context for our discussion as we move forward throughout the day. So first, the Pew Charitable Trust, who we are, we're driven by the power of knowledge to solve today's most challenging problems. We apply a rigorous analytical approach to improve public policy, inform the public, and stimulate civic life. And this is where we're located. All over the world, our main offices are in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but we have staff based all around the world and all around the United States. The Pew Center on the States is a division of the Pew Charitable Trust that focuses on building high-performing states that work efficiently and effectively to deliver better results, achieve long-term fiscal health through budget discipline, and make smart investments in programs that provide the strongest returns. And this project certainly fits all of those criteria. Election initiatives is a part of the Pew Center on the States, and we aim to improve the nation's system of election administration by examining options for building a system that is more efficient and accurate while reducing costs and administrative burdens. So when we focused on the need to upgrade, what our research indicated was that there are three areas in which our voter rolls are failing. Those areas are accuracy, cost effectiveness, and efficiency. We call it our ACE framework. Our research indicates, and this is research that we've conducted and will be releasing soon, about 24 million records nationally, or about 1 in 8 of the records on the voter rolls are no longer valid. That's active records, not inactive. That's solely active records. Nationally, about 12 million records, active records, have address problems. Nearly 2 million dead voters still have active records on the files nationally. Nearly 3 million voters have active records in more than one state. And about 1 in 25 records contains an address that is unmailable or doesn't exist. So think about that. The address information is just wrong on its face. Well, the biggest problem, the biggest reason we have these problems is because of mobility. Our society is only becoming ever more mobile in these days. And we know that, according to the census in 2008, more than 1 in 8 Americans moved. And that rate is double amongst young Americans. We see those numbers consistently holding in 2009. And we also know through our research that individuals who've moved within the previous 2 years are much more likely to encounter voter registration problems at the polls. Here's a great example in our neighbor state of Nevada. In Clark County, where Las Vegas is, as you know, they did a list maintenance operation, sending mailings out to all their voters within a 6-month period from November 2009 to April 2010. And they discovered that 150,000 of their 700,000 active registered voters had moved from the address on file just in that 6-month period of time. That's more than 20% of their rolls. Imagine how difficult it is to administer elections in Clark County when you've got 1 in 5 of your voters that you know doesn't live at the address you have on file and you don't know where they are. We also know from census information that tens of thousands of those people, it won't come as a surprise, what state are they moving to? Here to California. Costs are one of the other major problems. We did the first study of what it actually costs to maintain voter lists at both the state and county level, what it costs taxpayers. We did it in Oregon, thanks to my colleague John Limbach, who's the former state election director there. And we got all the cost levels from both the county and state level and determined it cost in 2008 over $4 per active voter just to maintain the list. That's not cost to third-party groups spend to get them on the rolls. This is just the cost to taxpayers of maintaining a voter registration list. That came to nearly $8 per transaction in 2008. Our research indicates when we've looked at other states that number is fairly consistent. And in the abstract, we thought, oh, wow, $4, that seems pretty high to us. But we didn't really know until we looked at probably the closest thing we could compare it to, which was Canada, which has been using more sophisticated technology for about 15 years, and it costs them only about 35 cents per voter to maintain their lists in a federal election year. That's 12 times less. The cost drivers, again, especially for the election officials in the room, you all know these very, very well. The printing of millions of paper forms, the data entry by hand, And the return mail and processing costs all lead to significant costs at both the county and state level. Lastly, with regard to efficiency, our system relies heavily on third-party voter drives and campaigns to register voters. This creates some administrative problems because the incentives for those groups are different than the incentives for election officials. They have an incentive to generate as much paper as possible, and they have no disincentive not to deliver all that paper right at the deadline. So what election officials, and I'll probably see a lot of nodding in the room, but especially at the county level, will get piles and piles of registrations dropped on their desk right near the close of registration, and that makes it very difficult to process all that paper, while also all of these other things with regard to election preparation are going on, getting absentee ballots out, getting absentee ballots in, training poll workers, dealing with polling places, etc. We know from our research that only about 75% of the eligible voter population is captured on our lists. That puts us pretty much near the bottom of all established democracies. Again, just for point of comparison, Canada captures 93% of their eligible voter population on their lists. That means in the United States we have about 50 million eligible voters who aren't on the rolls. And we know that these problems lead to problems on Election Day as well. Our research indicated that in 2008, 2.2 million votes were lost due to voter registration problems. Now, that's not people who couldn't figure out how to register and had to cast a provisional ballot because they weren't on the list. These are people who believed they had done everything necessary to register. They had handed a form to a third-party group. They believed they had registered at a DMV or something like that. They had gone through the process, what they needed to do as citizens, and when they showed up at their polling place on Election Day, they weren't on the list. And the sad fact is, someone like that is very, very unlikely to have their ballot counted. Now, in California, again, forgive the formatting problem, we know, based on the Secretary of State's estimates, that approximately 6.5 million eligible voters are not registered in California. It doesn't take much to figure out that that's larger than the population of most states in the United States. Because of a lack of a federally compliant statewide voter registration database, the state has difficulty in tracking voters across the county. Most other states, when voters move from county to county, it's somewhat seamless because the statewide voter registration database catches them. Here it's a manual process which delays things and can lead to errors. And there's also evidence of significant motor voter problems in California. Let me give you an example of that. The EAC just released a report on voter registration. It's up on their website. And they got voter registration statistics from all the states for 2008 to 2010. California reported that 608,765 total registrations were processed at their DMVs during that period of time. 11 states processed more than California during that same period of time, despite the fact that California by far and away is the most populous state in the United States. Look at some of these states. Indiana processed more than California. Kentucky processed more than California. Colorado, Illinois, Georgia, Arizona, Virginia, Texas, Florida processed more than twice as many registrations as California. Pennsylvania processed 3 times as many registrations as California. And then the state of Michigan processed more than 3 times as many registrations at their DMV as California, despite having 1/4 of the population of the state of California. So one brief anecdote, one of our staff just moved to California from the East Coast, and I told her, when you move out here, tell me what happens when you register to vote at the DMV. Has anyone in this room done that recently, gone to the DMV and tried to register to vote? So it's been a long time since I lived in California. It's 98 when I moved away, so I figured the system had changed. It turns out not that much. Basically, 2 separate forms were given to her as she approached. She filled out the licensing form, which was on top. The registration form was stapled or attached to the back. And she got called up to the front, and when she got there, she hadn't finished the voter registration part of it. And the clerk, without asking her, ripped the 2 apart, and put basically threw away the voter registration part of it. And she said, wait a second, I haven't finished filling that out. And then the clerk kind of sheepishly picked it up and allowed her the opportunity to fill it out. But just by anecdote, imagine how many times that must happen each day in California, especially given the statistics that I just went through. So Pew approached this problem, I think, and I hope in a unique way. We wanted to bring the experts, and in particular election officials, together to talk about how we could approach this problem and fix it. And again, not in a Band-Aid, piecemeal way, but in a comprehensive way that would really bring us all the way into the 21st century. And it wasn't just election officials, both from the state and county level, many of them in this room, many from the state of California, but also academics and also, importantly, technical experts from the private sector who understood how we could use technology to better serve taxpayers and citizens. We released that plan in May of this year. It's out there. We've got a Upgrading Democracy printout out there that you can take. But I'll give you the quick summary. One of the things I wanted to first mention is that there were a set of guiding principles that we had throughout this process from the very beginning, and these were based on what we heard from election officials, from others who were involved in this process, what was really important to them. First, any solution had to be feasible. We couldn't be talking about something that was pie in the sky. It had to be feasible, it had to work, it had to be based on technology that already exists. It had to be cost effective. This couldn't be something, particularly in our fiscal environment now, where you had to invest millions upon millions upon millions of dollars just to see some modest return. To give you an example of one small piece of cost effectiveness, online registration. We've done studies on this for quite some time. We had a study that we released in 2009 on this, looking at the two states at that time who had online registration, Arizona, who had instituted it back in 2002, and Washington that instituted it back in early 2008. They were the two states that had it for the 2008 election. Arizona has kept very good records on this, and Maricopa County, where Phoenix is, saved over $1 million in 5 years from instituting online registration. And just to give you an idea, every state that's implemented it, it's basically cost them a few $100,000. The cost to process a single transaction goes way, way down. In Arizona, it cost 83 cents to process each paper transaction, whereas on average, it costs 3 cents to process each online transaction. Something to note here, it actually cost 90% of these online transactions zero. It was just there were some that needed some human review, and they cost about 33 cents per, so it averaged out to 3 cents. As this has gone over time, we've seen a reduction in the number that require human reviews, so that number is actually even going to drop over time. And then, of course, printing costs have been reduced in the case of Maricopa County by 75%. So in California, one of the things to note is that the Secretary of State has reported to the AC that there are $70 million in federal HAVA funds that have yet to be allocated to a project. The system needed to be accurate. It needed to improve the accuracy and specifically reduce or eliminate, or come as close as possible to eliminating, duplicate and invalid registrations from the rolls, the deadwood that clogs the rolls. Another guiding principle, state control of voter lists. This was very important to everyone who was involved in this project. No one wanted to see a federal takeover of voter lists. This was the goal of this was to create a system that would not only maintain state control, but in fact augment state control by giving more information to the states who were participating. Had to be more efficient. We used the term flatten the curve. I mentioned the crush of registrations received at the deadline, and if we drew a graph of the registrations processed in any given election year, you'd see a huge spike at the registration deadline, especially before the general election, because that's when so many of them come in. It was one of the major goals of this project to try to flatten that curve, to process more voter registrations during the quieter times of the year. And granted, I used to say quiet times of the year, but there are no quiet election seasons anymore, but the quieter times of an election year now. If you can process more of these in July than in October, there's going to be more efficiencies bred. One sad fact right now is in a paper-based system, if someone moves today, it's very likely that election officials aren't going to learn about it, if at all, until October of 2012, even though they're going to be mailing things out in the meantime, etc. Reduced opportunity and perception of fraud. This is a concern for a lot of people, and certainly to the degree that the rolls can be cleaned up, the perception of the opportunity for fraud and any opportunity out there will be reduced. The system had to be secure, had to protect individuals' private information as well. So let me tell you briefly what the plan is, and like I said, feel free to pick up our report outside. We know it's feasible using technology currently in use in the private sector and other areas of government to implement a voter registration system that will be more accurate, more cost-effective, and more efficient by doing three things. First, making the process for eligible voters to get onto the rolls more automated. Second, harnessing the power of data matching to update records as people move, for instance. And lastly, reducing the opportunity for fraud by identifying duplicate and invalid registration records. And the design itself also has three primary elements. First, what we call better data in. This is using tools that are already in use in many states that have proven to be effective. The first I've already mentioned, online registration, has proven to be remarkably effective. There are now 9 states who currently offer online registration, most of them in the West, and there are 3 more that have passed legislation or are intending to move to online registration in time for the 2012 elections. Automated systems at motor vehicles agencies is another aspect of the design. Because of the problems with motor voter, which often results from the clerks having a disconnect, from the DMVs not having incentive to integrate voter registration fully into their responsibilities. There are states like Delaware that have implemented an automated system where the system automatically checks every single person who comes in for a licensing transaction against the voter registration database and offers them the opportunity to register, not through the clerk, but through an automated system that the individual directly interacts with. And it's resulted in tremendous benefits, not just in terms of enfranchisement and accuracy, but also in terms of cost. They've saved a ton of money, and a voter registration transaction at the DMV has been documented to go down from 90 seconds down to 30 seconds, reducing the length of lines at DMVs. Secondly, better data out. This involves a data sharing center that we call the Electronic Registration Information Center, where states that choose to participate will share data, like voter registration and motor vehicles data, and it will be simultaneously matched against all the other data, and then reports will be sent out to the states from this center. So if a state is participating, they'll put their voter registration and motor vehicles data. They could perhaps put other data into the system. And then whenever anyone appears to have moved, appears to have died, appears to be eligible but unregistered, a report will go out to the state for that state to take action on. Again, and this will be a constant effort. So this won't all happen in October 2012. It will happen as it occurs. If someone moves, a state will learn about it within 30 days. If a newly eligible voter comes into their jurisdiction, the state will know about it within 30 days and can take action on it. And lastly, some kind of fail-safe. Fail-safe can be a lot of different things. States have a great deal of leeway in this, but the main thing we want to avoid is that if for some reason the data center gets something wrong, like for instance it tells you someone died and they didn't die, and right now that happens because I introduced this as a data matching effort, but the fact is data matching efforts are going on right now. They're just not very sophisticated. They're one-to-one matches. We look at death lists to see if someone moved, try to compare it to the rolls. We just don't have that many fields to match, so we can't do it with a high degree of confidence. This system will be able to do that with a much higher degree of confidence and also tell states how confident it is in the match. If for some reason it gets something wrong, states have to have some protocols in place to allow that person to cast a ballot. So to give you an idea, we've been working with a large number of states on this. We're very happy with the reception we've gotten. States we've been working with, like I've said, over the past 2+ years on this. The states in yellow here, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, Delaware, and D.C., are eligible and intending to participate, and they didn't need to pass any laws to do that. They were already ready to do that. There are several other states, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Ohio, Maryland, and Virginia, that did need to pass a law specifically to be able to share some data with this system, and they have done so already, and they intend to participate. There are several states here, 4, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Hawaii, and Alaska, that are continuing to work towards participation. And then lastly, California, and we're continuing to work in dialogue with the folks in California and hope that we can bring California online as well. As everyone knows, about 1 in 7 voters in the United States lives in California. So California is important for a variety of reasons, but that's certainly one of the big ones. So that's basically the summary. Again, here's the website where any of you can go on at any point in time. One of the things I should mention about this is we were very concerned to find out what the public expected from their officials who are running their voter registration systems. And we did some research indicating, for instance, that a great number of people, a great percentage of people, believe that the DMV and their election officials already catch up with them when they move, even though they don't, or they automatically do. They automatically know when they move. But we wanted to go a little bit deeper than that, and so we engaged Public Opinion Strategies and the Mellman Group to do public opinion research. And with that, I'd like to call Bill McInturf and Aaron Strauss up here, who did the public opinion research, so that you can share that. It's not on here. Do you have another phone drive by any chance, please? Hold on just a second.
McInturf with Public Opinion Strategies. We're a Republican polling firm. Aaron Strauss is representing the Mellman Group. Mark Mellman is a well-known Democrat. Mark and I have worked together for 20 years and have had the good fortune to work with Aaron on this project. Both firms have very deep roots in California. Our firm has an office here. I've also worked in a lot of election reforms. The Mellman Group has worked for Senator Boxer. And so in this process...
Excuse me, can you turn the microphone on, please?
Yes. I think I could. Is that the right button?
There you go.
Thank you. So in this process, we were asked to take a look at what people thought. And so when we did that, we looked at first focus groups. And they were really particularly fun focus groups because we did a lot of groups we don't always do, including mobile voters. We looked at people who had literally moved in the last year. We did them in Las Vegas, so we very much kind of matched what David has described. We did military members, military households, who are a key focus of people who worry about slipping between the cracks and who the public worries about. We also did young registered voters, people 18 to 29, who have special interests and needs as it comes to registration. We looked at Latinos, and we also looked at core Republican and Democrat primary voters. So we looked at a lot of the folks who are most at stake as well as kind of the political profile. And then from that, we learned a lot from people from these qualitative settings. And the things that were really powerful to me about the qualitative work was, number one, you really hear Americans talk in very powerful ways about the process of registering and voting and how much it means to them. And I know that seems difficult to believe when we have, 40-45% of people don't vote in 2008 when we have this historic election. But the people who do participate have incredibly powerful emotional feelings about it that I think speak to what we can kind of help address here. I think the second thing, of course, that we heard a lot about was their concern about fraud, and then the counterbalance, which is, as Gail said, people are living every day. Half our country now is on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, and that's half our country, and then given what they describe for Amazon, how they use the internet, how they do this stuff, they're already kind of migrating and are telling us the other ways in which they are used to using online records. And the third thing that we certainly heard about is, again, their interest in making sure that military and other hard-to-reach audiences have access to the ballot. So from that, our friends at Pew asked us and then the fourth thing, which is another thing that David has helped emphasize, which is not federal. People see this as a state and county and local responsibility. There is, in fact, on a partisan basis, some distrust about the federal government. I think it does trip a wire when you talk about kind of a federal voter list. And so you'll see all of our language kind of talking about a state-based effort and not federal. And so from this work, we went on, and then we've done state-based work as an example. So we were working in states like Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and Ohio. And as pollsters, I think one thing Aaron and I can say is that, yes, there's some state-to-state variation, but it is really modest. That when you look at the questions we asked, that the differences by state are pretty modest. And so we've aggregated some of the data, and we're going to show it to you, but what's more striking is how much the data shares in common. So, number one, we wanted to know what's kind of the set point. And the set point is that, hey, guess what? There's, people's actual instinct is very simply, very quickly, they believe, yes, that it makes sense for the state to be modernizing their voter system. What you're going to see is in our questionnaire design is that, and again, Aaron did terrific work designing this questionnaire, and one of the principal authors, is that we start very simply, and then we start simply, we look at the basic support for these constructs, we give people more information, and then we give equal weight in terms of also giving people support and opposed information. So we start with a very simple premise. Do you favor or oppose upgrading your state's voter registration system by using state records like driver's license, change of address, and death records to update voter registration? I think, as David said, a lot of the response to the voters said, well, yeah, they already do that. And it is actually an eye-opener when they find out that in fact, does not always happen in every state and all the time. Support for that is universal. By the way, the other thing we do as pollsters is we said, basically, that's very limited information. Do you favor, oppose it, or do you not yet have enough information to have an opinion? And we feel strongly about that because, these are new topics. I will tell you, the average voters and the average person we're interviewing is not sitting at home worrying about voter registration laws in California when we call them. And so we let people opt out and tell us, well, thanks, but I just haven't thought about that much. And that's about 20%. So, but here's the other point. When they say favor, they mean it because they don't have to pick it. And so what you find is that there's no essentially high opposition, and that the favor numbers rate in the high 50s to high 60s throughout the states that we picked. Now, this is the descriptive language. Descriptive language means we explain what we're doing. And we kind of tell people more about how this would actually work, and we describe what would happen. And in that description, what we tell people is that we start by telling them that our job is to first let you register through secure connections on the internet. To increase accuracy by doing that match function. If there's a discrepancy found, you could be asked to update your registration, or if there's a discrepancy, it could be investigated if it's a questionable record. And then we said specifically, no national voter list would exist. And then we said all voter list and information would continue to be controlled by the state, not by the federal government. And by the way, that's how you use focus groups. We hear what's important to people, and as David talks about his core principles, and he talks about the core language we're using, it's because we're echoing back to people in a positive way the things they had concerns about to address those concerns in this description. And so what happens is support goes up. So, okay, I've heard that longer description. I know what you're talking about now. And support goes up to essentially 70% plus in every state. Now, this is the other thing. We are living in hyper-partisan times. I've been doing this for 30 years of my career, 20 in polling. I think it's fair to say Aaron is not quite as old, gnarled, great, or bald. But he has extensive experience. And if you ask us what we see at the moment, the world we live in right now is a red-blue world where about 80% of Republicans are on one side, 80% of Democrats on the other, and because the parties are relatively matched and independents break about evenly, all the data looks about the way independent data looks. What you don't see a lot of is a chart that looks like this. And the chart that looks like this is there's no functional difference by party. That at the point where you're describing the system of how we would go about modernizing and improving this process, that there's essentially an equal number across party.
Bill, for those in the back, could you just tell them what each of those three things are? Because they might not be able to see the labels.
Sure. You'd be missing a heck of a good chart if I didn't, so thank you, David. What's happening, the blue number is the percent who favored the proposal. So what's happening on the far left is that's the Republican number. And so the Republican number is 77 favor, 17 oppose. On the far right, the Democrat number is 76-18. My point being that's margin of error. That's literally the exact number. And by the way, this is the average across all 6 states, 3,000 interviews. So we took all the states, 3,000 interviews, aggregated all the data, and across all that found this incredible parity by party, with independents being 70-21. Now in that, the other thing we're talking about is intensity, where a plurality to majority of independents, Republicans, and Democrats also they strongly would favor that description. Now, what's one of the reasons that people respond so powerfully and quickly to this? And one is because they like the language about fraud. And so one of the things we found in the groups is that people do worry about there being fraud in the process. And again, what does fraud do? Why is it emotional? Because it violates the notion that my vote counts, and it means people are gaming the system. It's something that's fundamentally the core part of what we believe in this country. So one of the strongest reasons to talk about how this would work is that it prevents fraud. With better outreach to citizens who need to register or update their registrations, the influence of outside voter groups will be reduced. It will ensure only eligible voters are registered to vote and catch duplicate or inaccurate registration in an effort to combat voter fraud. I think there's another thing you need to know, and why we're working as a partisan team, is because the other core part of what our two firms have worked for, actually Mark and I have done this work together a long time, is a belief that every American should register, every American should vote, and any election reform has to lead to universal access and larger turnout in a way that does not diminish the ability to vote of any voter group or ethnic group in the country. And when we first were approached by Pew, of course, Pew said, yeah, that's what we're for. But that's something that's been, really, really important to us. At the same time, if you do what we do for a living, having a fair system that prevents fraud is a good thing. So what do we know? What we did as pollsters, we went back and tested that whole long statement they heard, and then bit by bit we took each element of the statement and said, do you specifically favor or oppose that specific element? And what it does is it echoes this fraud theme, because the two highest favored parts of that statement were there's a discrepancy found between the voter registration, the voter could be asked to update their registration, and if there's a questionable, they could be further reviewed to assure only eligible citizens are registered to vote. That about everything in that long description, those are the two most popular elements. Again, what did we learn? So what we learned from the groups and from this research is there's 3 or 4 key themes in terms of trying to communicate this to people and laying the foundation for reform. One, that we have a system that, there's an old Woody Allen joke about the 2 old ladies at the restaurant, and they said, they're saying, yeah, the food's no good, but at least the portions are large. So in the same way, what people are saying is, let me get this right, we have a very inefficient system where there's inaccurate voter lists, and we're paying a fortune for it, And so obviously that makes no sense to people. So the current system is we have inaccurate voter list, inefficient process, and it costs too much. That's clearly something people don't expect in today's world. Number 2, the data matching engine would not be a federal list and would not be controlled by the federal government. We are living in a Tea Party era, and the concern about one national voter list, the federal government, where the list would go, how it would be used, is significant, and that made a difference to people. And so, again, we're trying to improve accuracy and efficiency at lower cost, and we're trying to bring this in the 21st system. It is something that, again, people do talk about the process of registering and voting, and that process doesn't match their expectations for how they live everywhere else. I will say, though, as someone who uses the Virginia DMV, if in California they're getting to a window before they can fill out both forms, congratulations to the California DMV. Little lice some humor there. That is not my experience at the Virginia DMV. Okay, so now the other thing is, look, we're telling you got to answer concerns about privacy. That clearly, in a world where you talk about records being matched, multiple files, there's no question privacy is a big deal. And so one of the things that David did in his remarks, and you can see I was using our data, is talk about existing methodology, that we're not talking about anything that is not already being done on a routine basis, not already available. So what we're talking about is it'll be cross-referenced through different available databases to ensure information is correct. Today it might only be crossed by DMV if it's verified at all. And then we say the new data matching process could use 10 or more sources to compare registration information and ensure its accuracy. This is already done through the use of already available technology and utilizes power of modern technology. One thing we learn in the groups is there's not productive to go through what the 10 exact lists are and where they come from. The more you get into that, the more people start asking questions, the more they worry about privacy, and it's not productive. But if you say, look, this is not breakthrough, they already exist, it's already being done, and we're trying to capitalize and take advantage of it, it works. Now, the other thing we always do in our polling is we try to boil down for people what would the advocates say, what would the opponents say, so that people in the surveys have heard an aggressive argument on both sides. And so we, from the focus groups, said to our client, here's what we think are your strongest arguments on your side. Number one, that this is currently paper-based, it's out of date, and it's got inaccurate records. That you'll be able to compare information so records are more accurate. It will reduce the cost. It will make it easier for eligible voters to register. And then we hit such as members of the military who often face registration problems. In all of our groups and all of our data, the access to the military vote was a very important thing to people. So finally, it will reduce opportunities for fraud as duplicate and outdated records are removed or corrected. So, we're sitting in an assembly in the California legislature. People in politics always say, what is the elevator speech? If I'm with the legislator and I have only that brief time in the elevator, what do I say? What are my arguments? And that's what these things are trying to do. We're trying to say, if you have a few minutes in the elevator, this is what you would say. Now, on the other hand, we have to be fair pollsters, and we have to aggressively test the other side's argument. And from our groups and from the work we did, we said, number one, how would you attack this? If we were on the other side, what would we say? And number one, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why do we start off with that? First, because it does connect with people, because they don't wake up worrying about voter registration as the most important issue. And there's kind of like, why am I dealing with this? And number two, we are in the middle of a recession, which is exactly the wrong time to embark on a costly overhaul of our registration system, because, again, that fits. My gosh, it certainly fits this state. People are worried about every dollar, and they want to make sure it's being spent well, and they worry that whatever you tell me it's going to cost, once the state government and others start doing stuff, it will cost a lot more. Putting personal information from multiple states in one central place could be an invitation to hackers. It's too much like a federal government takeover of what's a state responsibility. The government has never been good at maintaining correct information, and creating lists with more personal information only makes matters worse. This is pretty aggressive. My point is, again, you would say, okay, that's really tough. And that's a tough argument to give people for a lot of good reasons why they might be concerned about doing this. Then that's our job, to make sure they forward each side fairly and equally. And guess what? It works in this regard. It does drop support. We're not in the mid and high 70s anymore. We switch people. But here's what's important. We switch people so we're still at a sustainable almost 2/3 of the public. And as Aaron and I and Mark have done a lot of public policy work, when you end up with, after that exercise of the 65-26 number, you're in a comfortable range in terms of sustaining public support. And again, some of these arguments really work, and we're showing you what they found is most convincing. Number one, that it would ensure members of the military are accurately registered, that would reduce the possibility of people voting twice in the same location, and that it's going to make sure that information is up to date, preventing problems at the polls. I think, in fact, one thing Pew's done remarkably well is that your presentation just tells us how pervasive some of these troubles are and at what cost, in a way that's actually quite eye-opening. Now, the point we're making is once we make those set of arguments, the opposition arguments do not test as high. That our arguments on our side are more pervasive and convincing than their side. So they've heard both sets of messages, and they've heard now each individual argument for and against it, and again, we still end up in the mid to high 60s. And these are realistic numbers. And I know our friends at Pew and Klein tend to say, uh-oh, gee, I'm a little worried because our first number was in the high 70s after you explained it. And my point is, this is good. This means we can demonstrate to people. We wrote an aggressive survey that gave people a lot of arguments on their side, and they did move, and it worked with some people, but it still kept support very, very high. And so what we're showing you is the kind of the difference between California and these other states, and as pollsters, actually what I'd say is these aren't really differences. These are margins of error. And it reinforces what I'm saying, that that in fact the data across these 6 states is very, very stable. Good-humoredly, I would say again, when David said, do we need to keep doing states? I said, of course, I wish to God, because I have 2 kids in college, I wish I could say yes. But if I don't see any differences between Ohio and Alaska and the first 6, I don't think the next 3 are going to be any different either. So I think we should stop. And why do I say that? Because, look, what does California have in common with Ohio or Alaska? These are really different states, but the numbers aren't different fundamentally. So what we're showing is the average of all 6 states on the left, and then we're showing you the California number on the right. The numbers in California, non-whites, obviously the Latino population is 20% of the poll. The Latino number and the African-American number in the state were right about the same number. There's not a large difference between African-Americans and Latinos. They are, in all of our states, a touch lower in support than the white respondents, but not to any kind of, again, fundamentally or different degree. It's important to voters to see this happen. Voters tell us that they think on balance it's very or somewhat important. But again, I will tell you from the focus groups, to be candid, we are at a time when people see lots more troubles. And it's not, so we're not suggesting that this is going to be a breakthrough issue, but I think what we're suggesting is there is a way to make it fundamentally important to people to communicate what you're doing. And with that as an overview, Aaron and I would be happy to compare notes and questions and talk about the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And while folks are thinking of questions, if you want to approach the mic, I just want to make a couple of quick points of explanation on some of the things. With regard to costs, I didn't go into a great deal of detail of this. We're going to talk about that in one of the future panels. But our recommendations, we estimate, will cost even a state like California a few $100,000 in that range. So it's something that we believe is manageable. With regard to privacy, again, there'll be a panel later in the afternoon where we talk about technology and privacy. But one of the key features of this is taking any private information and anonymizing it at the state level before it ever goes into any kind of data sharing system. And lastly, with regard to the military, we're in discussions right now with the Federal Voting Assistance Program of the Department of Defense, and it's been something Pew has worked on for some time. It's really, we've been working to improve the lot of military and overseas voters since we've existed, and we continue to work on that, and that's a key element of this. I think one of the things that really blew us away when we saw the numbers were a couple things. One, if you look at the numbers after we've presented all of the negatives and asked them what their overall level of support, they're higher than the first number, than when we first asked them what they think about this. So as they learn more about it, even the negatives balanced against the positives, we still get numbers. I think it was 69% in California, if I'm not mistaken. And then also the degree to which people think this is a priority, again, as Bill said, not the priority, but a priority, and would look favorably upon state legislators who supported this and unfavorably upon state legislators and officials who opposed this. The numbers were also quite high, and that really, I think, impressed us as we were reviewing the data. So with that, it's a great opportunity to get access and ask questions to Bill and Aaron here. So if anyone has any questions, you make your way to the mic.
Hey, I was wondering if any one of you could talk a little bit about ways that upgrading the system could prevent voter fraud, specifically with illegal immigrants.
And could you identify yourself?
Sure. My name's Kelsey Bynum from Capital Television News Service.
I will defer to David to talk about that topic. It's something, by the way, this one did come up in the focus groups. Our focus groups were held in Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, and Seattle. So if you're in Las Vegas and in Phoenix, especially in Phoenix, that's a topic you're going to hear about. But I will let David address the policy question about the immigration issue.
So we'll address some of the substantive aspects of the design in some of the later panels, but I'll briefly tell you one of the things we're trying to do is give election officials more information about the voters so it can be vetted ahead of time of the election. And the fact is that many state databases, like motor vehicles in many states, contains information with regard to citizenship on a lot of people. So, for instance, in many states, you have to show proof of legal presence. That proof of legal presence could be a U.S. passport, could be a U.S. birth certificate, for instance. If that's in the motor vehicles database, for instance, and you're 18 or over, we know you're an eligible voter. And then, the concerns about ineligibility melt away. And similarly, if we give better tools to election officials to review any questionable registrations, which they don't have access to right now, then we'll be able to clean up the rolls better.
Also, I just pulled up the California survey. For that question, assuring only eligible citizens are registered to vote, 84% favor that, and that 68% strongly favor that part of this plan.
Tracy Weston, Center for Governmental Studies in USC. Obviously, increasing voter registration is extraordinarily important. My question is whether any of you have had looked at whether it will increase voter registration disproportionately. That is to say, what if voter registration goes up significantly among Internet users, online voter registration, among Internet users, better educated, wealthier, whites, and didn't go up as much for lower educated, lower income, or minorities? It wouldn't hurt lower income. Their registration might be the same, might even go up, but disproportionately, they might find themselves falling behind. And I'm wondering if you have any evidence that, A, that would happen, and whether you've tested it in terms of polling.
So I'll address A real quick. We're going to address that specifically in the second panel after lunch today, so everyone should come back for that after lunch. That's a little plug, because I know it's hard to come back to one of these things after lunch. At 1:30, we're going to be talking specifically about voting rights, voting integrity, and how this affects certain constituency groups, because that was a concern for everyone involved in this project from the very beginning. One thing we know about the voter rolls nationwide. Voter rolls nationwide are disproportionately white, disproportionately wealthy, and disproportionately old. That is true across all states, and it's something that many have noted and been concerned about. Thus, the people who are unregistered are disproportionately the opposite. They are disproportionately people of color, they're disproportionately young, and they're disproportionately economically disadvantaged. Anything that reaches out to that 25% who's not eligible is going to lessen the disproportion that currently exists in the rolls. One great piece of data that indicates that it relates to online registration. Washington State implemented online registration in January of 2008, and in the last year or so, one of the things we can tell very easily from online registration is the age of people using it. It's harder to tell race and economic status, but age is obvious because you've got a birth date. Of the people who registered online in Washington State in the last year or so, 61% of them were under the age of 35. Think about that for a second. That really blew us away when we saw the number. 40% were under the age of 25. This is the way an ever-growing sector of our electorate, young people, which, as they're growing older, expect to be able to do this on the internet. I know Heather will talk about that later on one of the panels. So I'll leave it at that because I think some of the panelists will talk about that. But as regard to the polling, I don't know if you guys want to.
Well, that's why we did the Latino focus group. That was certainly a question that was raised by the respondents. But actually, just the CDC looks at kind of landline versus cell phones, and there are other folks in the government who look at online access. And actually, the internet access data is really quite interesting because the disparity between African Americans, Latinos, and whites sort of disappears under 30, 35 years old. that the disparity exists when you look at the overall data because African Americans and Latinos of a certain age essentially don't participate anywhere near whites. But at the under 35 years old, it sort of disappears, and so you realize it's a function of age, not race, and so it's not strongly part of the survey design because it didn't come up as a substantial concern in the focus groups. But I'm kind of echoing what you've said, which is the government data about internet access would suggest to me that that in terms of African American Latino access to like registering on the internet and stuff. And by the way, you're in a state, Texas, California, Arizona. There's an entire new generation of Latino kids who are going to be coming into this system, and everything that we see from the government data suggests they're going to be incredibly tech savvy, just like their whiter and perhaps sometimes more affluent counterparts.
And can I just add that one of the newest studies on the digital divide points to smartphones as a way to close that gap, in the fact that they are closing that gap. And when this becomes a tool for voter registration, I think you'll see a lot smaller gaps in terms of ethnicities.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next.
Hi, Evan Goldberg. I'm the Chief Deputy Secretary of State for California Secretary Deborah Bowen, so thank you for coming. Question/comment. I thought I heard you say on the privacy piece that the more you explain the data matching elements to people, the more concerned they became about privacy, so the response was to not tell them about the matching elements. So that is what caused me to stand up, which is just Mr. Becker and I have had robust discussions about this, and I know he has with Secretary Bowen as well, which is California is a very privacy-conscious society, probably more so than other states. In fact, to join ERIC, we would have to revise many of the statutes we have, such as the restricted uses of voter registration files and the restriction on Department of Motor Vehicle files and others. So those would be, I think, big sea changes in California and just shouldn't be underestimated in terms of people's, not because they don't support the end goal, but the impact it may or may not have on their privacy.
I think Dave's going to comment first.
Yeah. So privacy, as I mentioned, was a guiding principle from the very beginning in the design. And while privacy is very important in California, understandably so, we've also worked in a lot of states where privacy is at least as important. States like Montana, Idaho, Alaska, Utah, where privacy ranks consistently near the very, very top of issues that concerns them. It's one of the reasons that we successfully built privacy protections in from the beginning that actually exceed existing privacy protections, where data does not get used unless it's absolutely necessary, and it gets anonymized before it's used within the system, and that's been very important. As we've talked to stakeholders about it, and we've gone into a great deal more detail with stakeholders than we have with the general public. Stakeholders have asked a lot of very pointed questions. We're going to have Jim Dempsey from the Center for Democracy and Technology talk about this quite a bit, as well as some other technology experts, and Jeff Butcher of IBM, who's been working on this as well. So I'll leave some of that conversation to that last panel because I think that'll be very interesting. But we certainly designed respect for people's privacy into this from the very, very beginning. And it's very clear that once people understand the degree to which data is being used now, that privacy concerns also exist. I'll just throw it open to Bill and Aaron for any further comment on that.
Well, and again, just to go back to, we're having a good divide here between policy expertise and polling, and I want but from a polling perspective, you can't listen to the focus groups and hear these concerns and not understand how important privacy is and how much this raises this topic. And so we gave people this question at the end of the survey. And it says that, and there were two statements. Which of these statements do you agree with more? Statement A. Relying on the most up-to-date and secure technology, a modern voter registration system will protect personal information and ensure integrity of the voter rolls. The current voter registration lists are outdated and easy to manipulate, making them far less secure and putting private information at greater risk. Statement B. A new voter registration tool that relies on technology will be inherently error-prone and creates opportunities for hackers to access our private information. Having a central database with all of this information is far too tempting a target. And we ask people which side of that discussion when you come down, and by 2-to-1, 62-to-30, they essentially come down on the first side. So I'm not, and by the way, here's the thing that I would say for all of you here. First, we need to recognize that there's a passion, there can be a passion, even though only 8% strongly agreed with the second side. I know in any public policy role, every person here, that 8% can be an incredibly concerned, vocal group. And sometimes it's important to remember that intensity does not always match numbers. Number two, I hope, and thank you for giving me a chance to correct myself, I hope I was not communicating that we're trying to be less than transparent. What I was saying from, again, a lot of work that we do, and when you do public policy, you talk about public policy, what we're saying is you have these options. You can characterize and describe the 10 files, which is what we did in the poll, or you can list all 10 items. And all I'm suggesting is that for advocates of this idea, that if you list all 10 items, there's no question that the greater you get in detail, the more it gets to, more it gets to a prolonged conversation that in fact injects concerns that if you describe what you're doing and describe it in the way we've said, alleviates concerns. But from a Pew perspective, the other thing that's always going to be true is, it's like an FAQ. There's always going to be like, here's the first statement, and then like click more if you want to learn more. That's what I'm describing. Not that we would never not communicate that, but it's a click more if you want to see what the 10 files are, not that you would start like that in an FAQ.
And I think just briefly, one of the other things to note is that that language was used in the arguments in support section, which was followed by the arguments in opposition, where we used language that reflected on this idea poorly, trying to. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over now to someone we've worked very closely with, Jeff Butcher here. He's an executive IT architect from IBM. He was one of the experts we brought in from the very beginning to help us understand how technology could be used and how it's already being used in the private sector and other areas of government to bring about the kinds of improvements that we'd like to see in our voter registration system. He and his colleague Jeff Jonas, a distinguished scientist at IBM, have been instrumental in that. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff to kind of give an outline of what some of the technology design might look like.
Thanks, David, and for building me up so high. I hope I do a good job. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. And I didn't always work for IBM, but I've been working with matching people together since the early 80s. I've got the gray hairs to show it. And IBM bought the company that Jeff Jonas and I had built in 2005. Because we were able to match while still enhancing privacy. And that's really important to this project. We don't want to create a database with social security numbers and driver's license and stuff like that. So I'll show you how that works in these slides. So first of all, what is ERIC? So ERIC is a service that will help the participating states to cleanse their voter rolls of duplicate voters, voters that have moved, voters that have otherwise become ineligible to vote, and also another very important thing to help identify eligible but unregistered voters. Here's the case of Katie, who's on the Oregon voter registration roll and the Washington voter registration roll. But those two records by themselves don't match very well. You have a name and a date of birth only to match across state lines, and that becomes very difficult. So one of the processes of ERIC is to include additional data sources that can help glue these records together. When you were talking about the NCOA and other data sources that we want to incorporate to get the latest address and stuff like that, it's important to be very sure of the match. If you're going to do anything automatic without having to contact the voter to say, is this okay that we change your address, you need to have certainty. And with the technology that we're bringing to the table here, the more data that we add, the more certain we can be about the match that we're making. In this particular case, the inclusion of the DMV record gives us the address that glues these two records together by name and date of birth. And then, because on the driver's license we have at least the last four of the social security number, we can then be certain about our match to the Social Security Death Master. Again, name and date of birth alone, which is what the election offices have to deal with at the current time when they're trying to match to these other data sources, is just not a strong enough match. So, but how do we protect the data? And the way that we do that is we take any of the personally identifiable information, such as the date of birth, the social, the driver's license, and we do a process which is called anonymizing. Anonymizing is like it's not encryption. Encryption kind of leads to the concept of decryption, like somebody could actually decrypt this data and figure out what it is. A one-way hash is an irreversible digital code. It's a fundamental building block that's used in modern cryptology by agencies. And so what the record might look like is this. On the state side, before they send us the data, you could read the date of birth, the social security number, and the driver's license. But by the time it gets to Eric, the DOB will be CDB 034492CC. It's unreadable. And that anonymization occurs before the data is sent to Eric. Eric doesn't want to know and doesn't need to know in order to do his matching what the actual social security or date of birth is. So there you go. And so what information is required? So we're asking the states to send in their voter rolls and their DMV listings, and Eric is going to get the Social Security Death Master. And it's kind of important to note, each state currently probably downloads their own Social Security Death Master, and there's a cost associated with that as well. So by doing it once at Eric, we're eliminating some of the costs. And so with those three data sources, we can be more certain of the match. Future data sources will be forthcoming. NCOA certainly is a great idea, whoever mentioned that. And we really want to have this be a safe database. So we'll implement controls like when we're receiving a file from the state, we'll make sure that it's anonymized, or we will not accept it. And then what information are we going to share back? So some of the reports that Eric will produce for each state will be duplicate voters within the state, cross-state duplicate voters, those are people who have moved, deceased voters, and eligibility reports as well. So, but when we deliver these reports, it's not like one state's going to see the other state's driver's license number or social security or anything like that. All of that data is anonymized. If we wanted to show it to them, we couldn't because we'd never received what the actual date of birth or social was. And with that, that's kind of a really high-level summary of what the technology does. And if there are more technical questions, I can get pretty technical. I'll try not to. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And I should tell everyone, if you haven't yet picked up a copy of our report, it's online as well, but it's out there, and it goes into a great deal of detail about how this will all work. As you can tell from Jeff's expertise and the next speaker, Jim Dempsey, who I'm about to introduce to you, privacy was very important to everyone who participated in this project from the very beginning. And to that end, things like the anonymization, the one-way hashing that Jeff Butcher just talked about, as well as any action that is taken on a record in this design has to be confirmed by the voter. There is no automatic action contemplated by the design that Pew is recommending. No voter will find their records canceled without their knowledge or without their affirmative consent, etc. Now, as we move forward to our next panelist, let me just introduce Jim Dempsey. He's the Vice President for Public Policy from the Center for Democracy and Technology. And about a year ago, we started conversations with the Center for Democracy and Technology, which many of you know is probably the preeminent leader in assessing privacy risks in new technologies. And we wanted them to critically assess what we were talking about doing. The result of that is a report that you'll find out there from the Center for Democracy and Technology. We encourage everyone to go out there and read it. But we're very pleased to have Jim here to kind of explain what his findings were and talk about how privacy interacts with the system overall.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Here, I'll get it while you're...
Okay, thank you, David. And thank you to Pew for putting on this event and for including us in this process. Several of the speakers today referenced technology and the need to bring the voter registration process into the 21st century, and specifically to utilize some of the major developments that have occurred in the past decade in terms of how information is handled and used in any decision-making process. And huge strides have been made here. The first thing that Pew did right, and one of the most important things that they did right from a privacy perspective here, is they began thinking about privacy early in the development of their recommendations. They knew from the outset they're dealing with an important issue here. They're dealing with information, Social Security numbers, some other information that is of a sensitive nature. Information which, by the way, is already flowing, certainly within the states and to some extent between the states for voter registration purposes, but nevertheless, information that has to be treated carefully, both in terms of the security of that information and in terms of the reliability of the outcomes of that information. And as David indicated, over a year ago, Pew approached us, and we went through a lengthy exercise with them to raise the privacy issues that would be associated with an information sharing and matching system to improve the quality of state voter registration databases. And here it's very important to understand and to think about, what do we mean here by privacy? By and large, we're not talking about confidentiality, although there are some elements of the data here that you want to treat with particular care. And there are some voters whose data needs to be treated with particular care. Most states have special protections for law enforcement officers and victims of crime so that the database can't be used to locate people who have some sensitivity to their home address. But by and large, the issues, we believe, are better described by the concept of fairness, what is fair in the use of information. And for those who have been dealing with privacy now for some time, we talk in terms of fair information practices. How do you use information, exchange it, protect it in the course of making decisions about people? And there is a privacy and security framework that has emerged really globally over the past 20 years. We use a version at CDT that was actually adopted by the Department of Homeland Security, I think in 2008. And this is what the Department of Homeland Security Privacy Office uses when they are assessing information systems for Homeland Security purposes. It also can be applied in many, many other areas and is applied in many other areas. And we took that and applied it to the ERIC concept design and the overall updating voter registration design process that Pew was undergoing. And you have in front of you a summary of our findings. We really did our work in two phases. We presented to Pew a very lengthy report and analysis in December of last year when they were at a somewhat more preliminary stage in the design of their process, making a series of recommendations. Even in the course of preparing that report and going through dialogue with them, we made a number of recommendations to them, some of which they had anticipated already, others of which they incorporated as a result of our recommendations. Jeff Butcher's colleague at IBM, Jeff Jonas, sort of the co-designer of the system that Jeff Butcher outlined. Jeff Jonas is somebody that at CDT we've worked with for many years, and to some extent he has already grokked our approach and had already incorporated some of that into, a lot of that into really the design without our even having to tell them about it, because Jeff Jonas was already aware of where we were coming from. These are the sort of 8 points that constitute sort of the modern privacy framework that we've applied across the board in all of our privacy advocacy work, and which are reflected in the Pew design. And really they pose the questions that you pose in designing any information system. Even if you weren't worried about privacy, even if you weren't worried about security, just what does it take to make an information system work? You have to be able to answer these questions. What information are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? How are you using it? Who are you sharing it with? How long are you keeping it for? How are you protecting its security? And what sort of access and rights does the individual have with that information? And then finally, what oversight and enforcement mechanism do you have to make sure that you're following the rules that you've established? And you sort of go through a system design process. What is the purpose of the system? What information are we collecting? To be transparent about that, to be able to state the purpose. It would be remarkable, even in talking with federal officials on various information systems, how often a person will come in with a beautiful idea for all this information they want to collect, and you say, well, why are you collecting this information, and how are you going to use it? And the system designer doesn't even have the answer to those questions. Those are the questions that have to be answered, and I'm pleased to say that they have been answered in the design of ERIC, that Pew has gone about this very systematically. The concept that's used, it's again, an internationally accepted concept now. Some of the biggest proponents of it are in Canada, is privacy by design. You build your privacy concepts into the design of your system, addressing these 8 points. And with that, then you have assurance that the system, as it moves forward to implementation, has the technology design, the policy, and the governance structure, that is the auditing, oversight, and accountability structure that gives you confidence that your rules and your policies are actually being followed. So there's more in the paper that you have. I'm happy to answer additional questions. It's been an honor to be involved in this process up till now, and I look forward to seeing its full implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim said, we've been very fortunate to be able to get guidance from Jim and his colleagues who are leaders in this field so that we could build privacy by design into it from the beginning. And I encourage everyone, if you don't already have a copy, after this is all over, get a copy of the Center for Democracy and Technology's excellent summary report. With that, I'm going to move on to Pam Smith, who's the president of Verified Voting.
I'm short like Kathy, so I hope you can see me over this thing. The good fortune of going after somebody like Jim is I have a lot less that I have to say, because he covered a lot of really important points that matter to us at Verified Voting when we look at how you can use technology responsibly in improving our democracy. In a very timely turn of events, the Pentagon just released their cybersecurity plan, and in it they declare the Internet a domain of war, which doesn't mean they've declared war on the Internet, but they made a really good quote about reliance, and they said, our reliance on cyberspace stands in stark contrast to the inadequacy of our cybersecurity. And they brought this up because it doesn't mean that we're not going to use the internet, but we have to know that there are needs to be able to use it in a secure way. There are 57,000 fake sites that get developed every week. These are fake websites, and many of them are, of course, banking websites trying to get you to go to a site that isn't really from your bank to gather your information, and some of them are to get you to go to eBay pretend sites, but some of them are also government sites, and they're good ways to collect information about people. So as technology is a tool, an implementation of that tool is really everything. The devil is in the details. You can create something, you can sort of push on it here, and down there somebody falls off a bridge. So you want to make sure that you're not doing harm as you do this. And I think that a lot of these points that are built in design make this project an example of how you want to think about these things first and try and do no harm as you're getting going with it. We're really pleased that this project plans to examine these challenges of privacy and security issues that can come up through the use of experts in a strong advisory capacity, such as the proposed Security and Privacy Advisory Board. And we also recommend that usability and reliability are factored into the advisory board's work as part of that. That experts are brought in early enough to make a positive difference, and I think they already have been and will continue to be. What are some of the most important principles to think about in enabling the responsible use of technology here? Well, I think the most fundamental property you want is to have a system that's resilient to errors. Some kind of way to correct before harm gets caused for things that go wrong, because it is in the nature of things to go awry. To put that in the context of a voting system, for example, you need a way for voters to assure themselves that at the time of voting that their votes were recorded the way they intended, and you need a way for election officials to be able to use that to prove that votes are counted accurately down the road, and that builds confidence. The proof has to be observable and understandable by the citizens, the average voters. Without that element of observability, you lose some of that justification for the confidence in the outcome. That observability basically closes the loop on a good system. So it's not enough to have a good law and a good system. There's always going to be a need for interested citizens to be able to assess that it's being carried out correctly and that a good system is being deployed the way that it should. And that brings me to something that Eddie had pointed out about existing efforts and being able to use those in conjunction. It's really humans that implement the technology. So humans have to be able to observe that the system provides a suitably transparent way to check for accuracy of its operation. And I think that some of these features have been built in here. If you look at recommendations from the U.S. Association for Computing Machinery about voter registration databases, and one of the recommendations about creating and managing and using statewide voter registration databases is to, if you're using other databases to check for eligibility, then they should be used for screening and not to automatically enroll or de-enroll voters. And that's built into this plan. An automated check can be used to flag some voters for further scrutiny, but the determination of eligibility should be performed only by an appropriate individual. That's a human. That's built into this plan. So we're really happy about those elements of transparency. I'll close by saying that in the United Kingdom, they started trialing data matching this year, and they wanted to allow the electoral registration officers to be able to compare the electoral register with other public sector databases to make sure they could identify eligible people who might be missing from the register. And they weren't going to use it towards an accuracy measure until they first saw if the matching process was helping with the completeness measure. And I should point out they were really concerned about completeness because they were only at 91%. So I think that building in these fail-safes in parallel to implementing this, I think, is really key. And I'm glad that Pew has invited all of us here today to put these different aspects on the table. And I'm very grateful that they've thought to consider security in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And I just want to add, Pam and others at Verified Voting have been a tremendous resource as we've considered aspects of the recommendations that we're making, and notably people like Professor David Dill at Stanford and others who have brought their expertise to bear in their advice and comments, and we're very appreciative. So with that, I'm going to go to the next panelists. Shane Hamlin is the co-director of elections from Washington State. They have, as we mentioned before, pretty extensive experience with online registration in particular. So I invited him here to talk about that today. And with that, Shane, come on up.
Well, thank you for that introduction, David. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to start by thanking Pew for inviting Washington State to participate in the conversation today about technology and using technology to improve voter registration in California. I'm also pleased that we have worked with Pew on a number of projects, including ERIC, which has been discussed quite a bit today. And then I'll start with giving an introduction about Washington State, just to kind of frame the context for our experience with online registration. We have about 3.6 million registered voters. We are entirely vote by mail, and we just joined Oregon in being entirely vote by mail. We have a bit of a hybrid state voter registration database, meaning unlike Oregon, it is not a top-down, centrally state-controlled database. The counties actually enter voter registrations, and those are uploaded to the central database that we maintain. And since Heather was here earlier, I'd like to just shout out for us. We recently received the #1 ranking in Rock the Vote's recent survey of states that provide programs and services to improve voter registration and participation among young voters. So very happy to be #1 and hope we can continue that ranking as we move forward. So Washington has offered online registration since January 2008. And we were second after Arizona, and we went after it for the same reasons that have been discussed today. We wanted more accurate rolls, we wanted to save money on voter registration costs, and we realized that there was a public expectation to be able to conduct business and interact with their government online, just as they do with banking and paying their bills and making purchases and so on. So our goal in designing our online registration tool was to make it as simple as possible for the user while protecting the integrity and maintaining the integrity of our voter registration system. In a nutshell, what it does, it allows anybody in our state with a state-issued driver's license or ID to, on a secure website, complete a voter registration application and submit it. There is no paper involved. It is a completely electronic process. It works very similar to how other states are doing it. We, at the end of the process, the applicant is giving us permission to go to the Department of Licensing in our state, it's called, and acquire the digital image of the signature that's already on file with the DOL, and transfer that along with the rest of the voter registration information that they've entered into our system and then down to the counties for processing. The project took about 7 months. I'd actually say we need a little more time than that. We had to rush to get it out. We weren't required to deliver it when we did to the public, but we wanted to make it available in time for the February 2008 presidential primary. There were 4 vendors involved, plus the vendor for us, Microsoft, to enable the local county systems to communicate with us and transfer these registrations. We spent about $279,000 on the project, and we used our HAVA funds to build it. In seeking the legislative authority to offer this and then in responding to constituent concerns and media inquiries, some of the key messages around security that we focused on were, one, it's actually more secure in our mind than a paper registration process. And some of that came up earlier today, but a couple of ways that's true is, one, in order to get a state driver's license or ID card, you actually had to show up at a Department of Licensing office and prove your identity. Physically, you exist, which means unlike a paper registration that could be completed for a non-existent person, you actually did show someone in a state office you're a real person. Our model in terms of security and the infrastructure, it's modeled after the banking industry. We use secure servers, we use SSL certificates, and even though someone would have to have a list of valid driver's license numbers in order to generate or attempt to generate a number of automatic fake registrations or register people that aren't registered, we included with the process CAPTCHA imaging, a CAPTCHA image, which I think most of you are familiar with. If you've done an online transaction, you get to the end and you have to key in letters or numbers that are distorted or an image or something like that. So that's at the end of our process, and that's to help against those bot programs that might attempt to generate automatically thousands of registrations that aren't real. So I mentioned earlier the public expectation piece. We knew that the public was ready for this and that people were already doing a lot of their business online, both with government in terms of renewing their licenses, but also in terms of banking and financial transactions. And Arizona and Washington were part of a Pew study in 2008 to 2010, and some of the findings of that study, I think it's probably available on Pew's site. I would recommend it to California or any other state that's looking at online registration. A lot of great information there, great findings. Two of them for note today is that over 90% of the people that used online registration in Arizona and Washington said that it was very easy to use, and 95% said they'd recommend it to any other state for their voters or for their citizens to use. Even among those, and here's another finding, even among those who did not register online, they registered on paper but then were given a description of online registration through this survey process, they recommended the support was very high. 70% of the folks who registered offline believed that internet registration would be more convenient than traditional methods, and 70% also state that they would use online registration to re-register or to update their information. And I think those 2 points underscore a finding from a 2008 survey, the largest conducted on Election Day in 2008, that found that 1 in 4 voters already assumed that we were updating their information automatically. In terms of data, there were questions earlier about how many online registrations we receive. In 2008, 160,000 registrations were completed online. That's a high watermark year during a presidential election. That's about 38% of all registrations for that presidential year. 2009, about 37% of our registrations were conducted online. And in 2010, a midterm year, it actually was the majority at 55% of all registrations we received. And we'll be curious in watching in 2012 to see if online registration keeps pace in a presidential year with paper registrations. About 40% of our users of online registration are age 18 to 24. If you include the 25 to 34 demographic, it jumps to over 55%. Savings. We've definitely achieved savings. The state saves about 25 cents per online transaction. We've recovered about half our costs and expect the rate of the recovery of our costs to increase over the next year and a half as we move towards that presidential election and more people use it. The counties are saving anywhere between 50 cents and $2 a transaction. And we estimate that the voters have saved about $300,000 on postage by not having to mail in a voter registration form. So that's definitely a savings both for the voters, for the counties, and for the state. But I will tell you just in closing here on my remarks, I feel like as great as online registration is, we need to continue to move forward in Washington. Mobile applications are definitely the future. We need to have mobile applications for voter registration so that we can put those in the hands of third-party groups so that they can go around with their tablets and their smartphones and register people that way and get it directly into our system, or at least make it much easier to get those registrations into our system. So thank you.
Thanks, Shane. And I should just add that Shane and his colleagues in Washington State, and in particular Secretary of State Reed, as well as their neighbors in Oregon, have been at the front lines of trying to constantly push the envelope and look for new reforms that can better serve their taxpayers and their voters, and they deserve a ton of credit. Before I introduce Dave, I just wanted to say a brief note about election officials. There's several of them in the room. You've noticed we've had them on panels. If you recall the map I showed you near the beginning of the states who are intending to participate in our project, you'll notice that there's a huge cluster of states out west. Almost all the western states are participating. And regularly I get asked, why? Why is that? Why are you focused out west? You guys are based in D.C. And I can only tell them what my feeling is on this, but everyone here in the West, I hope they recognize they are blessed to some degree by having this cadre of professional election officials who are nonpartisan, who work to ensure that the wheels of elections are constantly working. It's something remarkable. Not everyone in the United States has that. A lot of states and counties have bipartisan boards that are embroiled in gridlock. There's just not the tradition of professional election administration. I just wanted to say that by way of introduction to Dave, as he's the last panelist of the day. Dave McDonald is the Registrar of Voters in Alameda County. And, I mean, is this right? You're still the Information Technology Director in Alameda County as well. They're not paying you enough, by the way. I don't know what you're making, but they're not paying you enough. Based on that background alone, I think he's the perfect panelist to kind of wrap up today's discussion, particularly on the technology panel. So I wanted to hand it over to Dave.
Well, thank you very much. So, last speaker of the day. What an honor. I'll try to get you out of here pretty fast. I am the IT director. I've been the IT director in Alameda County for about 26 years, and I've been the registrar of voter for the last 5. And trust me, being the registrar of voters was an accident. It was never on my career path, my career plan. 3 weeks before a major election, our registrar left and went to another county. There was no assistant registrar. And so my bosses, the board, asked me if I would step in and run that election. And it was a temporary, one-time only deal. So here it is 5 years later, and I'm still doing it. So that's don't ever take a temporary job is the best thing I can tell you. Okay, so I'm a technology guy. Everything I see has a technology solution. It doesn't matter what it is. So I come into elections, and it's a little bit different environment. In that period of time, back in 2006, there was a huge controversy surrounding touchscreen voting, as you recall. Alameda County actually was one of the first counties to, after Riverside County, I think, to install touchscreen machines. We were the first county in California to remove touchscreens. And so it was just a happy accident that we did that. So as an IT guy, I came in with a little bit different philosophy than you might think. And it's really more of a high-tech, low-tech approach. And the low-tech approach is when you walk into a polling place, you get a paper ballot, and you get a pen. And that's all the technology that you're going to use in that polling place. Now, we do have touchscreen machines. We have roughly around 850 polling places for a major countywide election. And so out of those touchscreens, out of all those polling places in the presidential election, we had 1,010 people use touchscreen machines out of 730,000 people that voted. So very, very low use. So that's the low-tech part, and that's worked out very well. The high-tech part is really on the back end, and that's where all the election officials really suffer. There is so much work to do. It is mind-boggling, and I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir a little bit here because the election officials know this, but the dedication, the effort that it takes to run an election and get it certified is absolutely extraordinary. And so what I thought my talents could best be used in streamlining that back-end process. So just a couple of things that we did. Every election, you have all the people go to the polls, they sign in on the roster index. After Election Day, staff have to go through, and next to where you sign, there's a little barcode. And so after the election, staff goes through all of these roster indexes, and they have a little handheld barcode scanner, and they scan each and every name. And so that's hundreds of thousands of names that get scanned. So what do you think? 100% accurate? Not even close. Very easy after a 12-hour day to start, your eyes go blurry and you're scanning the wrong line. So we would spend about a week, and we'd have 30 people doing that scanning. And it drove me crazy, and I knew there had to be a better way. So we automated that scanning process, and now it takes us about 4 people for a day and a half, and we're done. And what that allows us to do is then we can go on to other processes, like processing provisional ballots. So that's one of the things we've done. Another thing is radio frequency identification, RFID. Are your eyes kind of glazing over at this point? Well, nobody's ever used it, right? Well, everybody in this room has used RFID. If you go across a bridge and use Fast Track, that's RFID. If you have one of these ID badges, like I carry around, that get you in a door, that's RFID. So most people in the room have used it at some point. Well, we put RFID tags on some of our key assets, such as memory cards for our scanners at the polling place. And so this allows us to track where all that equipment is all the time without somebody having to fill out a piece of paper. So in the past, what we do to track our chain of custody is I would have one of these key components, and I would sign a 3x5 card. I would pass it along to somebody else, and they would sign that 3x5 card. So again, that's about 4,000 pieces of equipment that we're tracking, and throughout the election process, the odds of that being done correctly are pretty minuscule. So we put in RFID, which means you don't have to touch anything, you don't have to scan anything. When you get in the neighborhood of an RFID reader, it's read and we know where that piece of equipment is. Our chain of custody reports now are absolutely unbelievable. It's kind of exciting for me every time, after every election when I look at it. So all of this and a few other things we've done. Somebody was talking about iPhones and iPads. We developed an iPad, iPhone application. Back in November, we ran our first ranked choice voting election, and we did a lot of outreach. And one of the things we did was develop an iPad application, free application that people could download and have a little demo of what ranked choice voting was all about. So that was very effective. All of this results in a couple of things in Alameda County. One is we certify our elections pretty quickly. For a major election, presidential election, we've been certifying just before Thanksgiving, which is pretty quick. And you know, part of the reason for that is I tell staff if we're not done, you have to work on Thanksgiving, so they have a little incentive to get going. But we get that done quickly, and our costs have decreased quite a bit in the last couple of years. When it comes to voter registration, I mean, is anybody in this room against online voter registration at this point? I mean, it seems like it should just be a done deal in California. So I think we're all in favor of doing that. One of the reasons that I think that's such a great idea is we had a local television reporter who's since retired. He was doing a story on dead people voting, and he was convinced in Alameda County we had a lot of dead people voting. Well, like any good reporter, he wasn't going to let the facts get in the way of his story. So even though I talked to him, showed him all the data, didn't matter, he ran the story. And you know, it was a great story because they had, during the piece, they had a graveyard and they had smoke coming in and spooky music about dead people voting. And then before he interviewed me, he said, "Is there something you can do about my registration?" His first name was Randy, and we had entered his name as Candy. Well, I looked at the form and it looked like a K to me, but that's the kind of thing. If you could do your own registration, there is no data entry error. We're getting right now, in a period of time, this is a very slow time, and we're not a large county like Los Angeles, but we're getting 1,000 forms a week that we have to key in. That's a very time-consuming process. So at any rate, I think we're all in favor of online voter registration, and I really want to thank Pew for sponsoring this, and I am very excited that we may get there. So thank you very much.
I think we'd all like to thank Flav McDougall for that great report. Sorry, that was a data entry joke. Thought this crowd would get that. So as you can tell from Dave's talk, one of the things why we thought he might be great at the end of this panel is to kind of highlight ways that election officials at the state and county level can demonstrate leadership to address these challenges that clearly exist. And we're going to open it up to questions in just a second. I'm going to ask the first. I wanted to follow up on a point Pam made, which is that when assessing privacy and technology and how it's being used, it's really people implementing technology. And we've got a system that has people implementing it now, and it's a paper and mail-based system. One of the things I always talk about the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, I was at the Justice Department. It was my responsibility to enforce it. I believe very, very firmly in the noble goals of the National Voter Registration Act. But it could not have been implemented at a worse time. It enshrined paper and mail at a point in time when we were just about to move into the internet age. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask all the panelists is just your thoughts in general about how what some of the proposals Pew and its partners have made here relate specifically with regard to privacy and security to the status quo, to the current paper and mail-based systems that we have, and that's just open to anybody.
I think one of the things that I was thinking about when I mentioned that was that there are places where technology does a really good job, and there are places where humans do a really good job, and they're not necessarily the same places. And technology might help you a lot with data entry, where humans maybe fall off a little bit. And humans are much better at making a determination about something that might be a little ambiguous and hard for the machine to determine. So that was kind of my key thought process there. But I think there's a role for a hybridization of the process.
Yeah, I would say when it comes to privacy and security, think about that paper registration form and the people that are out there registering voters. And I think all of the elections officials in this room have had the experience of third-party organizations registering people, and they're getting paid to register. And that's, they don't always follow the rules. And so it's fraught with a lot of danger. So if you can register yourself online, and we have the controls in place, I think that would eliminate a lot of that.
Further add to Dave's point, in Washington State, relying on those third-party groups with paper registrations, I just kind of thinking about the risk and security issues involved in that versus risk and security involved in online registration. It's really apples to oranges. We hand a box of 1,000 voter registration forms to some guy from some organization, and we hope that we see maybe half of those get returned, and they get returned on time. I don't know how many times organizations have brought in, and just in the last year, voter registration forms, and they're beyond the deadline. Those voters that they went out and got are not eligible because the organization didn't get them in on time. So you've got to really think about what is the risk in the current system, compare it to what you want to move to, and accept some base level there.
And I can just say from having talked to election officials in some other states where motor voter is being complied with to varying degrees. You talk to election officials in a state like Michigan where motor voter seems to be working exceedingly well. They'll tell you that there's not that much third-party activity in their states, even though Michigan is a swing state in many federal elections. But here in California, because motor voter, the numbers are so low with regard to motor voter, there's such a heavy reliance upon the paper that's being put out there by third-party groups, it appears, which puts further stress on the system. Jim, did you have some thought?
Yeah, well, just Dave and Shane are exactly right in terms of when you think about the security of a electronic system, your question is compared to what? And the issues that are being faced in the voter registration field are exactly the same that are being faced in other fields. Take medical records. So obviously there's, are paper records really that secure? You've got hospital employees calling reporters and reading out the medical diagnoses of movie stars and so on that end up in the tabloids, et cetera. With an electronic system properly designed, you can have an audit trail as to who's looking at what record. You can have a permissioning system so that only certain people can look at certain parts of records. And you can have a identity management system so that you know who your employees are, who's looking at what, who's logging in at what time. I think some of the data maybe in the voter registration field is less sensitive than, let's say, in the medical field, but the design concepts that can be incorporated into a system are the same and can actually give you a degree of control and a degree of accountability that is lacking on the paper record side.
Thanks.
Just as Dave was saying, as well as his RFID use of asset tracking, which is another form of using technology to manage things, vastly improving your ability to keep track of your physical assets as well as your data assets.
That's great. Thanks. I'm going to open up to questions now. I see Derek standing back there, so why don't we start with Derek, and then we'll continue on.
Thanks, David. Yeah, Derek Cressman with Common Cause, and I had a question for Shane about sort of the timing and mechanics of how you implemented the online registration in Washington, because where we're at in California is looking at doing it on a county-by-county basis as opposed to necessarily statewide. And we're in a situation where we don't yet have our statewide voter registration database in place, and there's a question about whether or not we can use HAVA dollars to help fund this, given that. I was just wondering if you could talk about how you did it in Washington. I thought I'd read somewhere that it may have been done county by county there, and so was that the case, and were you able to use HAVA funding or whatnot?
Those are good questions, Derek. Yes, we used HAVA funding, and we implemented it after we had launched a statewide voter registration database as required by HAVA, which we launched on time in January of 2006. It was not done on a county-by-county basis. It was implemented statewide. Now, in California, you're obviously dealing with a number of different circumstances. No statewide centralized voter registration database yet. I can't speak to whether or not you could use HAVA funds for a county by county. I don't know the legal issues of that around the federal use of the funds. But I think it seems like there's such momentum here for online registration. And given that Cal Voter, I think what it's called, is several years away, the loss over the next years, especially with the presidential election coming, I'm sure there's a way to implement it on whatever the legislation, however the legislation is written now, in a way that will help kind of maximize its advantages and benefits in time for 2012. And still make it, still have systems that would be compatible with Cal Voter when it's ready, and keep those systems and design specs in the mind as you're building Cal Voter. I just would really hate to see you not have it by 2012, given some of the other issues you're dealing with.
And I should just add briefly, we've talked to a lot of the states that have implemented it. Oregon, for instance, used HAVA funds. I think pretty much virtually every state that implemented it used HAVA funds, with the exception of Arizona, because when they implemented it, HAVA funds didn't exist.
And I don't, the reason I said I wasn't sure about that is because I don't know if there's a requirement that you have to have your VRDB before you can do other things with your HAVA funds. I heard earlier California is $70 million. I don't know if they're sitting on it because they have to have the VRDB first.
Yeah, well, and Evan has gotten up to respond to that. So I'll let him speak. To our knowledge, there has not been any challenge to any state using HAVA funds for the purpose of implementing online voter registration to date, and that is only continuing as more and more states do it. Evan, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. Just to respond, and Evan Goldberg again with Secretary of State Deborah Bowen. That $70 million that you referenced earlier, that is set aside to build the replacement statewide voter registration database that will include online registration as a component of it. There's a question relative to the bill Mr. Cressman was referring to, as whether we could use HAVA funds, separate HAVA funds, in advance of that to simply do online registration with a signature component. The answer to that isn't clear. We've asked the EAC if that would be permitted, and we've asked them to respond by mid-August. To date, they haven't responded. And another note, just on a technical thing, the Senator Yi's proposal is not county by county any longer. So unless the intention is to go back to that, it would be done. All counties would point to the Secretary of State's office. The data would be submitted through their signature obtained and then sent back down to the individual county level, which I think is roughly how it works in Washington State.
And I should just say real quickly, the $70 million number is actually, this is based solely upon the Secretary of State's filing with the EAC, the HAVA State Amended Plan in 2010. It's actually separate from the statewide voter registration database, which is separately allocated. I'd encourage everyone, there's some great information on the Secretary of State's website. Most of the information, a lot of information you've seen in this has come from their website. They do a great job of posting a lot of that. But the 2010 amended HAVA plan is there, and you can look at the numbers. And it does say $71 million is not allocated to any other project separate from the statewide voter registration database. So people can go there, and I'm sure I don't want to hang you out there, but if people have any questions, can they contact your office?
Always.
Okay, great, thanks. Any other questions? This is your last chance. We're in the home stretch, so. Going once, going twice. I'm not going to exercise my prerogative and keep folks here longer than they need to. So I am going to go ahead and release the panel, and then we'll wrap up so everyone can get home, hopefully start an early weekend. So let's thank this panel. Everyone on it was great. So I'll just wrap up with a few thoughts here. First of all, there's been a lot of talk throughout today about the Pew Project and Pew's recommendations, et cetera. One of the things I want to say is that this isn't a Pew Project. I mean, Pew is a major player in it. It is a Pew Project to some degree. We're very proud of the work we've done in this area. But it really represents a partnership amongst a diverse set of very experienced stakeholders, most notably election officials in a variety of states. This would not have come about if Pew had just decided we're going to fix voter registration and we're going to tell every state and county what they should be doing. We intentionally did not do that. We brought election officials and experts from all over the country together and asked them what are the problems and how can we address those problems. And the design, and everyone, if you haven't gotten it already, get the report on your way out or look for it on our website. I think you'll see the design really tries to address the concerns that election officials and citizens and technical experts were raising about the system that, as I think John said earlier, if we had to build a voter registration system from scratch today, it would not look anything like this paper and mail-based system that we're stuck with. I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of where we're going from here. We are in the process of talking about building ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. That will happen this year, and states will begin what we call onboarding into that system shortly thereafter. States will run ERIC. Pew is not going to run ERIC. The federal government's not going to run ERIC. The states who are participating in ERIC are going to run ERIC for themselves. ERIC will take in the data and it will start sending out reports. Just so everyone knows, one of the nice things about voter registration is voter registration records to the large degree are public. If we get information from ERIC that says these 1,000 people have moved, one of the very first things we can do is take a representative sampling and call those people up and see if they've actually moved and see if ERIC's working before we even go to the point where we have to contact those people and ask them to confirm their information. This system is designed to give the voters control over their own records and not have anything automatically happen to the records without the voter confirming the information. Throughout the second half of 2011 and through 2012, we will onboard states. You saw the map. We hope to have many of them onboarded through the presidential election of 2012. And during that time, we'll also be designing an evaluation of this system. We plan in 2013 to release a comprehensive report that demonstrates the benefits to accuracy, the decreases in costs, and the benefits to efficiency created in those states that have chosen to participate. And we certainly hope California is one of them. And compare it to the states that aren't participating. And what we know is that the states that aren't participating are going to see many of the same data points that we shared with you here today. That the lists are largely inaccurate, that they don't get enough of their eligible voter population on the rolls, and for all that we pay an enormous amount of money. So we look forward to continuing to work with our partners in all of the states, and especially in California, to try to get positive reform established, try to improve the rolls for everybody. If anyone has any thoughts or questions at any time, you should feel free to contact us at Pew, contact your election officials, etc. I'm sure this dialogue will continue, and we certainly hope it will. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to particularly thank Chairman Fong again and his staff for helping us get the room, and the Secretary of State staff and the election officials who are here today for participating. We couldn't have done that without you here. So thanks very much. With that, we will get you out a half an hour early. So put that in our bank for the next time. Thank you all. Safe drives home.